Okay, now you can see we have removed all our tapes, the tapes across the deck and the tapes holding the sides to the bottom. And now we are ready to take the wire ties out. We'll pull out these wire ties up here, and we'll also take out the wire ties at the back because they'll be in the way of the Draketail wraparound, which is the next step we'll be working on. These wire ties at the front, there are a couple of options. You could just break them off, and that's fine. And then sand the tips flush. But this system of heating the tip of the wire with a soldering gun is very slick and kind of fun. The only warning though is that if you touch the wood with the hot tip of the gun, you're going to permanently stain the wood, burn the wood, and that will not sand out because it'll be too deep to sand out. So if you want to do this technique, you want to be quite precise. I've clipped the wire so it's just sticking out a quarter of an inch on that side, and it's the full length on the other side. And when it gets tight and hot enough, that wire will just pull right out of there, just like so. And I may have touched, be careful when you pull the wire out that it doesn't pull the gun against the side of the boat. However, that's quite simple, and but you do need a something pretty warm, soldering gun or something. And if you don't have that convenient, just break the wires off flush and sand the end of the wire flush. Okay, we'll go ahead and do the rest of the wires. And those back wires should not need heating because remember we on the back wires we stopped our fillets before the fillet got up to the wire surface. Okay, and we will soon be working on the Draketail. That's going to be fun and exciting. That's the last part of our actual hull shape, is getting the Draketail wraparound onto the boat. On the Draketail wraparound piece, push it out gently from the sheet that it's in. These are in sheet number 4, and the inner one is the smaller one, I believe. No, the outer one is the smaller one. The outer one is the one to start with. We've included 2, one in case you're too rough with it, or if there might be an inherent flaw in that particular piece. And if you break the first one, you have the second one. The second one is larger though, in case your glue up in some ways somehow has gotten a little bit off from the exact dimensions of the boat as intended. In which case the larger Draketail wraparound piece will cover the Draketail and turn out fine. So let's start with the smaller one because if it fits, it'll mean less sanding around the edges for you. And you can just start to sand the tabs off, sand a nice smooth edge, sand off all the fuzz on the edge, and you can start to sort of massage that piece into its more extreme wraparound. Choose the nicest side for the outside, of course. And you can start to kind of see how that's going to bend to get around that back end. Don't bend it farther than it needs to go though. And then this is a good time to sand off. I have just a couple of marks of epoxy on the side here, and I think those will sand out pretty easily. But just a reminder not to try not to get epoxy fingerprints all over the side, because some people will want to bright finish the sides, and that can be really elegant. But even if you're going to paint the sides, if you have a lot of epoxy on the sides, you'll need to sand that a little bit, or else your paint won't go on evenly. The painted wooden surface will look a little different from the paint over the epoxy. So try to keep fingerprints to a minimum, and you don't want epoxy on your fingers anyway. And I'm going to sand some of these epoxy bumps off the bow. just so it looks nice while I'm working on it. So that's a start. We'll do a little bit more there at the bow. And then that was the 120 grit. I'm going to flip her upside down. And with the 80 grit, I'm going to start to clear my, level off my chines here a little bit. Anywhere the sides are overhanging the bottom and creating a lip there. See, there's a lip right here. So I'm going to sand that down. Overall, things should be fairly even. Always sand parallel to the wood grain. As soon as you sand across the wood grain, especially with an 80 grit, you're going to scratch the wood grain so deeply that that's the paint, under the paint or varnish, that scratch will show. So always sand parallel to the wood grain, never perpendicular to it. So we're just trying to sand the chine so it's flush with the bottom. If the bottom is a little bit higher than the chine, than the side piece at the chine, don't sand through that bottom veneer. Just leave it alone there. But the edge of the side, wherever the edge of the side is standing proud of the bottom, you definitely want to sand those off with the 80 grit, and then you can switch to the 120 grit when you have most of the material removed. Okay, so that's just kind of for fun to do that now, but it sure does make it look clean and neat. So I'll do the other side as well. And more here. So in this sanding, you're just keeping your block flat. When you switch to the 120 with the 80 grit, you don't really need to sand the bottom with the 80 grit. You're just going to put some scratches in it, but then you have to sand out even when you're going parallel to the grain. So with the 80 grit, I was more or less trying to just sand the side, where the side was sanding proud, the edge of the side. But now with the 120 grit, I can keep the sanding block flat on the bottom and sand the bottom and the edge of the side at the same time. And that way, we're not trying to wrap the block, the sandpaper, around the side. We're not trying to create a curved surface there. We're just trying to create a flat surface at the edge of the bottom pieces. This time when you can sand that, you might have wanted to pull that back tie out with the heat trick, but it's probably just as easy just to sand it flat. The copper sands pretty easily. And leave the tie in place. Okay, so that's getting pretty nice actually. Okay, I did want to show you on this side, keep your deck in place to keep the hull shape there. On this side, with the boat upright, just check your Draketail and your rudder support column angle. And you can look underneath and make sure that the angle is just right, that you're touching alongside the back edge of the rudder support column, and that you're just touching the bottom of the bottom edge of the bottom pieces. And you can check your bevel on the bottom pieces by sanding now around the edge. You're not really you don't want to change the shape of the back deck support piece with this sanding. So you're just using that as a guide. You're not really you're not putting much pressure on the top of the sanding block there. You're just using that edge as a guide to improve the angle of your bevel on the bottom pieces. Don't change the shape of the bottom pieces. The very bottom piece, you're just really trying to bevel the doubler. The very bottom piece, of the hull should not be changed in shape. So don't be too aggressive here because you might misshape that bottom piece. And if there's any epoxy anywhere, any bumps of epoxy, make sure you sand that off too. Okay, that's looking very nice. If there's any epoxy along the back edge of the sides, you want to make sure that's sanded out entirely. If there's more leak through there, you could use a file there, but I really don't see any epoxy coming through there. If your epoxy for that fillet was too runny, you might have gotten some leak through, but if it was the right thickness, you probably did not get any. And if the side was tight against the 7AB bulkhead, you probably did not get any epoxy coming through there, which would be ideal. Okay, now we've got that all cleaned up, ready for the Draketail. I'm going to do a little more sanding just for fun. You could wait till later. We'll do more sanding later as well. But it's kind of fun to get it cleaned up and looking nice at this stage. And then very shortly we'll be back to work on the Draketail. You can get an initial. I'm going to go get my stand, but you can get an initial. And you know, just this is a note. You get a lot of these paper binder clips are kind of sharp. If you end up setting the boat on top of a binder clip and then work on the bow and press down on it, you're going to get some dents in the bottom. So try to keep scissors the same. Try to keep your work surface. Even the copper wire will dent the bottom a little bit. So try to keep your work surface clean wherever you're going to be having the boat sitting down on the work surface. And don't dent the bottom, because then you either have to sand it out, the dents out, or fill with epoxy and then sand. And that's just extra unnecessary work. You know, I can use my blocks as a partial stand there for a minute. And I'm just going to wrap this around, choose the best side out. Just going to wrap it around initially, show you how that will go. Okay, that's looking quite nice. Although, yes, actually that is fitting just right. Remember that it's flush at the bottom back, but it's not flush with the deck. It should be level with the top edge of the side pieces, which means that it is not, it's up above the deck significantly. And that looks like that may just fit in exactly right, just the way it's cut. Anyway, looking pretty close there. We'll show you how we're going to fit that more precisely later as we get to that step. But yeah, I think we're looking, doesn't that look nice? Very elegant. The Draketail is nothing quite as elegant as the Draketail on a motor launch. Yeah, very nice. Okay, now one more detail before we get to attaching the Draketail. If somehow your fitting was not as precise as we ideally would have it, you'll be fine, not to worry. You can see on this side, it really is nicely positioned, just covering about half of the 7AB bulkhead along the edge there, and the same on the other side. So that's what we're aiming for. So, and the same, half the 7AB bulkhead is exposed along here, just behind where the side ends. So that will give us enough surface area to tack the Draketail wraparound piece onto the 7AB bulkhead. However, if your side piece got skidded too far back or something and you don't have that exposed half of the 7AB bulkhead there, not to worry too much, because there's a quick and easy solution to that. However, it may take a little touch of sanding. The solution will be to use just a little, create a little, not exactly a ledge, but just a gluing block. And you could use just a piece of the 1/8 inch by 1/8 inch cedar that was originally used for the shelf, just a piece cut off the end from the piece that you used for the shelf for the deck to sit on, along the sides, on the inside of the sides. That would work out perfectly, but just about any little piece will work. And that can be glued right in against the back edge of the 7AB bulkhead like that to extend, give you a bigger surface area. The plus of that is it's going to give you a bigger surface area for the CA when you're putting on the Draketail. But the negative is that after we have the Draketail wrapped around and CA tacked in place, we are going to spread a fillet on the inside, and this extra little piece here will make it a little harder to get that fillet into that corner. In fact, you won't be able to get right in the corner. So if you don't need to use the little filler piece to extend the 7AB bulkhead edge back a little bit, then I would recommend not using it. But if you really don't have any part of the 7AB bulkhead to attach the Draketail to, then do go ahead and put that in. Putting these pieces in with CA is fine, or you could use epoxy either way, but then you have setup time. You want them to be flat against the 7AB bulkhead, and I do have just a little bit of epoxy bump right there, and I think on the other side of it I have a little epoxy bump at the top. If you don't need to use these little extension pieces, then you don't have to worry about that epoxy. If you are going to use them, then try to sand that epoxy off and get it flat. Then you'll notice if you do have the edge of the extension piece lined up with the outside edge of the 7AB bulkhead, that the extension piece, the back edge of the extension piece is going to be sticking out and make your Draketail piece stick out too far. So you're going to have to sand the back edge of that extension piece off flush, so your Draketail piece won't be pushed out of place by it. That's another reason why I'd rather not use those extension pieces if not necessary, because if you don't get them sanded right, then your Draketail piece can't lie flat against the bottom edge of the bottom and against the edge of the deck there. So that's a little preview there. Another aspect of the Draketail, and a lot of people run into this, and I've got it, I'll show you on my boat here. It's tricky, it's really difficult to get the back of the bottoms as flat as tight together as you want them, and if they're pulled apart just a little bit, not to worry. Mine are pulled apart less than 1/8 of an inch, but more than a 16th. Well, about a 16th, I would guess. Yeah, about a 1/16 of an inch gap here. If I'd gotten those a little tighter, my bottom would be a little bit flatter, and I wouldn't have the lip of the bottom showing below the Draketail. But I'm not worried about that. There are two solutions to that are really quite simple and easy. And one is, and we'll use both of them in combination. One, the bottom pieces are quite thick back here because it's 2 laminations of plywood. So we'll sand underneath to flatten that bottom ridge out, but we won't take the whole ridge out that way. We'll also do a little bit of a fill at the bottom of the Draketail, extending the Draketail, so we don't have a gap there at the back. And we'll do that fill primarily with phenolic powder in the clear resin, because that'll sand and fare more easily than the pre-thickened resin. Okay, so a little preview there, because you may, in doing your initial fit of the Draketail, you may have noticed that the Draketail doesn't come quite all the way down to cover the bottom pieces there at the very back edge. But that's the beauty of epoxy, that we can fill with epoxy, and it's just as strong as the epoxy is just as strong as the wood. So and then it's easy to fare the epoxy as well. Okay, so a little preview there. We'll be back with you shortly here. After I'm going to sand a little bit more along my chines and a little bit more at the bow, just to clean up those areas, clean up the epoxy bumps where the wire ties were, and I'll clean up the stem a little bit, and that'll just look very nice and neat and pleasing. Talk to you in a minute. Well, initially I was planning on using the smaller of the two Draketail pieces, but on doing a little bit more fitting and fiddling, I think I'll have an easier time with the larger Draketail piece, because the larger Draketail piece will hang out quite a bit below this, where this bottom piece is, and I'll just sand that off. With the smaller Draketail piece, I was going to have to do a little bit more work, filling in just a little bit where this bottom isn't quite as flat across as it could be, because there's a bit of a gap right here. I would have had to do a little bit of epoxy fill to extend the Draketail piece. So the larger Draketail piece, and I could also sand the bottom. So that would have turned out fine, but I think this will be a little bit less work. Now, one aspect of the Draketail piece is that if you just wrap it around and butt it up here, you're going to have a big gap behind the Draketail piece. This won't be against here, and if you push it, if it's too long an arc, and you try to push it against, you're going to have some distortion, and this won't be a smooth curve. So what we're going to try to do here, a little tricky. Extra pair of hands here would be nice. Get on the stand securely, and I'm going to hold the back edge where you can't see it, so it's lined up exactly right at the top edge there, where you can see. Oh, well, can you see that? Yeah, I think you can see this, where it's lined up exactly right here with the side piece, the top edge of the side piece and the top edge of the Draketail wraparound. And I'm going to hold it so it's exactly lined up with the back edge of the side piece, and then I'm going to wrap it around tight, make sure it's against everywhere, and see where it falls on this side. Now let's skid it a little bit there. That's going to be the tricky part, is keep it from skidding, so you can mark it and get an accurate measurement and then trim it to fit. And we'll test it several times and trim it several times. There, now I think I have it tight against everywhere, and I'm going to mark a very light pencil line on the side, although I'm not going to be trimming the side. I just want to know how much I need to trim off the Draketail. So it's quite a bit. See, that's almost 1/4 of an inch there. Let's check that measurement again, because it was a little bit awkward trying to hold it in place and do the pencil line at the same time. So gently wrap it around, and yes, that looks very precise. It's the right angle and everything. So you can see it's pretty even at the top and the bottom, but it's a little bit, I need to take a little bit more off the bottom than at the top. Now, I suppose you could take that all off one side, but then the Draketail piece won't be exactly symmetrical. So I'm going to cut that, I'm going to divide that amount in half at the top and at the bottom. I think you can measure it if you want, but I can do that by eye pretty accurately. Then I'm going to take my ruler, or you could use the calipers, but I'm going to take my ruler and measure that amount at the bottom. That amount at the bottom is exactly, almost exactly 1/8 of an inch. And the amount at the top is going to be just under 3/32. Not quite 3/32. So now I'll transfer those measurements onto my both sides of the both ends of the Draketail piece. I think you can see, here's the Draketail piece here. Let's get the boat out of the way for you. The Draketail piece. And at the bottom edge it was 1/8 of an inch. And at the top it was just under 3/32 of an inch. Okay, and then you can draw that line. Draw these pencil lines lightly because we're going to just gradually sand back to the pencil line. And if you later on the pencil line, if the pencil line is still showing, we'll sand it off. So if you do a really heavy dark pencil line, it's going to be harder to sand it off the surface there. Okay, and 3/32, and at the bottom 1/8 of an inch. Remember, 3/32 is less than 1/8 of an inch by a 32nd. 1/8 of an inch is 4/32. Okay, and now the pencil line. Now, ideally, if I sand back to my pencil line on both sides, I should have a perfect fit. However, I never trust my measurements totally, so I'm going to sand back a little bit and on both sides, and then fit it again and see if it looks like I should be sanding all the way back to my pencil lines. Okay, and then to remove that material you want to use the 80 grit. And it's probably going to be easiest to have the piece just barely hanging out over the edge of the table to do your sanding there. Because and then you don't sand up, you might break your piece. Be sanding down. Most of your force when you're actually trying to do the cutting and the sanding is on the downstroke against the surface of the table. If you stick it out over the table very far, you're going to break it. So just barely sticking out over the edge of the table by the amount that you want to sand off. And don't do an upstroke, just downstroke. Initially, get that edge parallel to your line, and then once it's parallel to your line, start to sand in towards your line. I'm going to sand about 2/3 of the way in towards my line, and then I'm going to do another fitting. Okay, so you can see I really haven't gotten to my line yet, but I'm getting closer to it. I think you can see the line there. I'm about a little over 32nd away from my line there. And I'll do the same on this side. And now let's try a fitting and see how close we're getting. We haven't sanded all the way to our line, but we're within a 32nd of our line on both sides. And make sure you're lying flush against the back. We're very close. We're very close there. The angle looks pretty good. We're tight against the rudder support column at the back, and our lines look pretty good. So let's keep going a little bit more and we'll check it again. And we'll go almost to our line now, because the lines did look pretty good. The line is still showing on that side, but I sanded almost all the way to the line. Okay, and again, on the second side, the line is still showing, but I have sanded almost all the way to the line. Okay, flush with the side, top edge of the side on the back side there, on the port side of the boat. Wrap it around tight, and there, we're coming in pretty close. And you can look down between the Draketail and the back of the deck, see if there's a gap. Look at the side here, that's really nice. Try pushing on the Draketail at the back. Is the Draketail bubbling out, bubbled out from the back, or is it in there real tight? I think we're tight. So we sanded almost exactly to our pencil line, but the pencil line is still showing. And that's what I was guessing, because remember when we originally wrapped it around, our initial pencil line on the side to give us a measurement was a pencil line width away from the edge. So that makes sense that we now are a pencil line width away from the edges here as well. If we'd sanded our line out or exactly right to the middle of our line, this piece might be a little bit short and we might have a little bit of a gap there. I'm going to try fitting it from the other side, wrap it around and see how I like it, and flush at the top. If it's not flush at the top with the top edges of the sides, you can't tell anything. And again, yeah, I think that's very nice. It looks really quite true. And it is laying pretty tight against the bottom there. Let's see. Yeah, I think we could take out just the slightest bit more. But now I'm talking about like a, less, about 1/100 of an inch, less than 1/100 on both sides. Okay, now let's go with that. If there's a little bit of gap underneath between the Draketail and the bottom edge of the plywood, bottom pieces of the hull, we can do a fill with epoxy very easily there. But you don't want a large gap by any means. And remember, it's hard to see that gap underneath when you're looking at it from the deck side, so you can only tell if you've got a gap underneath by whether that Draketail pushes in and deforms when you push where it should be hitting the bottom of the hull. Okay, nice. Okay, now to get our Draketail attached, we will use CA. Now that we know, get this so you can see it. Now that we know if we start the Draketail right on one side, it's going to end up right on the other side. We have to have, you have to have faith here, an exercise of faith. So if we start the Draketail exactly butted up here, right on this side, it's going to wrap right around and be exactly right on the other side. We could sand a little bit more on the other side after we get this side CA'd, but it's not. It would be awkward and not quite ideal. Now, if we make a mistake and line up the bottom edge there, our Draketail piece is not going to fit at all. So don't make a mistake and line up the bottom edge. That's going to be sanded flush. Line up the top edge very precisely with the top edge of the Draketail wraparound piece, very precisely with the top edge of the side. That's how we did our sanding and our measuring and everything. So don't mess up right here at the end when you're close to succeeding. Okay, so I'm going to move the camera a little bit so I can work at a better angle. Positioning your body and the boat relative to, so you're working at a good angle for yourself, is part of the key to success. A little bit like playing tennis. If you haven't got your feet in the right place, it's hard to hit the ball right. Okay, let's go with that there. Okay, and you'll be able to see more easily, and I'll be able to reach it more easily. So we're going to do our CA joint right along the back edge of the 7AB bulkhead. If you didn't have close to half of that 7AB bulkhead exposed, then remember you will want to glue on your little cheater tabs here. Okay, an exciting moment here. We get to add our Draketail wraparound. And the key things are going to be to have a tight fit right up against the back edge of the side, so you don't want to have an angle, a weird angle there. I mean, you could fill it with epoxy, but you really don't want to have to do that. And to have an exact fit up and down, so the top edge of the Draketail ply is exactly level with the top edge of the side plywood. So I have to slide it up a little bit. And the best way to get that a tight fit is by feel. You can feel a much smaller gap than you can actually see often. So if that feels exactly level, you're good. Okay, now what we'll do, and I may have used the word tack inappropriately here, we're actually gluing the edge of the Draketail wraparound piece to the in place here to the 7AB bulkhead. We want that to be a real serious glue joint. We will afterwards spread fillet on the inside with epoxy on the inside of that piece to the 7AB bulkhead, but we really want to glue this securely with the CA. We're going to let this side set up, and then we're going to wrap it around. Make sure it's flat, not bowing out anywhere or out at a funny angle. You want it to be right at the right angle when that CA sets up. We'll just be holding it in place until that sets up, and then we'll wrap the wraparound to the other side and do the same on the other side. And then from the inside, we'll be doing a fillet along where the wraparound joins the bottom pieces and up the sides where the wraparound joins 7AB. Okay, now you don't want the CA to be squeezing out all over the place, but at the same time, you don't want to be short of CA. So this is a very quick, you don't have a lot of time, working time on this project. This is going to be a very quick thing. So have your piece right where you can grab it. In fact, I just set it right on there so I can grab it easily and put it right in place easily, because I only have a few seconds once I spritz the CA with the accelerator. And I suppose you could do the CA without the accelerator, but it takes so long to set up, you're going to just be sitting there trying to hold it in place for too long, and your hand might get tired and let it slide. So although this is a lot of the time pressure is on here, but I think you're more likely to get a good result using the accelerator than not using it. Okay, so here we go. Now, one point that's important here is the deck still has to be removed because we want better access underneath to get these fillets in place. So and also it's not glued on anywhere else. Don't get your CA up under the deck, and so keep it clear of that. In fact, it's probably a better idea to remove your deck here. So lift it out at the front and slide it forwards. I'm just going to slide it out of the way. Bow out. And slide it forwards. Okay. And now we won't have the deck getting glued on. Okay, are we ready? Here we go. This is going to be fast. I'm going to start at the bottom and work up. Whoa. You don't have to rush until you spritz it. Once you spritz it, you gotta be quick. Okay, and right in place there, level at the top, and then hold it in tight. Don't get your fingers glued on though. Check the top again, not a bad time to have somebody else involved. They could do the spritzing for you. Okay, and again, hold it twice as long as you think you need to, because you don't want it to let go when you let go of it. When you take. Okay, and I'm pushing it on pretty hard there, pretty tight. And I'm visually checking the top edge against the top edge of the sides. And there, we should have it. Nice tight joint, and that should be solid. And also, another thought, you don't want to have pulled the, I think we're good. You don't want to have pulled the piece around at all and hold it here, because that would be prying the side out that you're trying to glue tight. So you want it to be pressed against right up close to the joint. Okay, and we are very, very level there. Everything looks good. And now the wraparound. And we should come out exactly right. Make sure you pull it tight so the Draketail is against the bottom at the back. There we go, now we're tight. Okay, so that's going to be a bit of a trick, getting it tight enough that we don't have a bubble of Draketail sticking out at the back, because although we could fix that with an epoxy fill, we'd rather not have to. We'd rather have it just laying in there right against the back edge right here, tight. And if we've got our sanded edges exactly right, the length of the Draketail wraparound exactly right, and we get it in there tight, butting up right against the side piece, we should be really in good shape right down here. Okay, so again, getting this position, I'm going to get the deck out of the way because I want to be squeezing in there without the boat moving sideways. Okay, so we'll move that totally out of the way. Okay, and again, we want to make sure we're flush right across here at the top edge, and we want to make sure we're tight in against the bottom of the bottom of the boat. I'm finding that the way this is fitting, I'm just a teensy bit high at this joint. But you know, that doesn't bother me because I can sand that down. I just want it tight in the back, and I want the joint tight. If I'm just a teensy bit high, right there, the Draketail is a little bit, like a 1/16 of an inch above the edge of the side, that's fine. I can sand that down. I'd rather have that than have it pushed out with a gap at the bottom. Okay, so are we ready? You only get one shot at this, really. I mean, I suppose there's always a way to back up and redo things, but it's not easy to it's trying to undo this joint. It's not going to be easy once you get the CA on there. So let's try to see if we can finesse it the first time. Okay. Again, I'm going to start at the bottom and work up, right in that groove, right in the corner there, with a pretty healthy bead, but I don't want it squeezing out all over the place. Okay. Now I don't have to rush until I spritz it, but then I've got to be super fast and really good. Okay. So here we go. Spritz, spritz, and wrap it around and pull it tight. And it is in there tight against the back bottom and against the edge of the back deck support piece. And hold this longer than you think. Don't quit early here. Oopsie. Don't glue your finger on. Because there's a fair amount of force. You're asking this, you want this joint to be totally set up, because otherwise it'll pop right open. Because there's a fair amount of force. I'm pushing hard on this to keep it in place. Right up tight. And I'm pushing down, I don't know if you can see my other hand, with my hand of my left thumb, I'm pushing down on the middle of the Draketail there. I'll show you in a minute. Okay, that should have it. Good. That's pretty nice. In there pretty tight. So with my left hand, I was pushing down on the Draketail right here to make sure that it was against at the bottom. And you can see that's tight. It doesn't push in at all. It's right against the bottom all the way around. And it's tight at the top as well against the back deck support piece. So I think we've got it pretty good. When I run my finger along here, there's a bit of a lip here, but we'll be able to sand that off and get a smooth finish right there. And we will be, well, that's pretty well, that joint here is pretty well filled with CA. But we'll put a little epoxy over that as well and sand it smooth. And we are a little bit high. I don't know if you can see that, but we are a little bit high here. And but that'll sand down. We'll just have to make sure we sand it down evenly so it doesn't, you know, dip down and then go back up. Okay, so let's try to take care of that. But overall, I'm very pleased with that. And it looks elegant. So, a little tricky there, but, and if you have a second person to lend a hand, that might be fun to do together. This is the 80 grit. I'm taking it down so we have that angle right. I mean the level right here. I'm being careful not to sand the side down any. So I don't want to sand that. And I'm sanding more here, but I'm ferring it back here gradually into the back. So most of the pressure is up right where the joint is. Then I'm going to switch to the 120 and finish that up. And sand this joint a little bit. Okay, it's coming together. Okay, nice. Now I'm going to do just a little CA. It's going to be hard for you to see this, but these two pieces aren't perfectly aligned yet. So I'm going to do a little CA from the inside and then push the side piece, the back edge of the side piece in so it lines up perfectly. It's lined up pretty well down below, but right at the top edge is where it's because the fillet on the side piece ends near the top of the 7AB. And the same is true here, where you know, the side piece is sticking out just a little bit. But the CA will take care of that easily. So I don't know if you can see this or not. So just a little CA there. Oopsie. There. And again, we have a little time before we spritz it. If you have somebody else, they can spritz it. You can hold it in place and then they can spritz it. Now I gotta be quick and hold that. Don't get too much CA on your finger though. You'll get attached to your boat. I'm sure you're attached to it already emotionally, but you don't want to be attached to it physically. I don't know if you can see that. So the CA, this medium CA is liquid enough that it'll wick right down into that joint. But remember, in the joint, the accelerator isn't really getting into the joint, so you may have to hold this a little bit longer. Okay, oops. And it's a little stuck to the boat, but not too bad. It doesn't hurt to, you can spritz it again actually. Okay, now we got it. That's nice. And the same on the other side. Okay. And then spritz it a couple shots, line it up, and hold it. Now I'm sighting, whoopsie, I'm sighting from right above it so I can see this. Oh gosh, slippery. I can see this exactly lined up there. Most people will want to paint the hull, in which case you have several options, because you could do a slight epoxy fill here. It doesn't, it's not even hardly a fill, it's just a coat of epoxy. Or you can sand a little bit more, and if you go through the top veneer on the Draketail Wraparound, it's not an issue. But if you want to bright finish it, and bright finish the Wraparound too, you definitely would not want to sand through the veneer on the Wraparound. But most people want to paint it, and that looks really nice, and it's a little easier and very traditional and everything. And then you don't really have to worry if you get into the into the middle there of veneer on the Wraparound a little bit. This is with the 120. The 80 grit would be a little bit too aggressive for this job. Now it's starting to feel pretty flush. And you can see I have gone through the surface veneer in just this one little area. That must not have been quite as tight right there. But not a problem, since we're planning on painting this part, the side pieces. With a painted finish, you want there, that's really quite nice now. A little bit more right there, but this is very, very, very nice. With a painted finish, you want this joint to be very, very smooth, because you don't want to be able to see it. Yeah, that's very nice. And we will still cover over that with epoxy and sand it some more. Okay, and then visually make sure you're sanding here on that top edge looks smooth. I actually come along here and then I go up a little bit, and then so I'm going to sand that now with the 120 a little bit more. That looks nice. And then I'll do the same on the other side, the second side, getting this smooth, but then I'll let you work on that. But now I'm going to work on the bottom. Now you can see how the Draketail piece extends a little bit. There's a ridge there, so there's a fair amount of sanding to do here. And I'll start with the 80 grit and take that edge down, and then I'll switch to 120 grit. Okay, so I'll go ahead, and that's going to take a few minutes. I'll go ahead and sand that down. If your 80 grit is getting a little dull, switch to a new piece. And then we'll move to the inside and get the epoxy fillets on the inside. Okay, be back soon. Okay, now every boat will have minor variations in this area, depending on a lot of factors. On my build, this side is very tight, right along here. A bit of a gap at the very back, but nothing to worry about. But this gap, there's a bit of a gap right along this side where the side and the bottom come together. And that's causing the side comes along, very smooth and level, and then it bows out just the slightest bit right here. That gap's just a 32nd at the most. But I want to push that in, and when I push this in right here, the rest of the Draketail is a nice smooth curve, no bowing out or distortion. So I'm going to put just one dot of CA right in there and see if that holds. spritz it, and then hold that in tight there. And you know, you could use a couple of dots, but really this joint is going to be held from the inside with an epoxy fillet, a non-sag fillet on the inside. So I'm just trying to get it in position because with an epoxy fillet, you're not going to sit here holding it for as long as it takes for the epoxy to set up. You'd have to have some sort of clamping system. And it's so much easier with the CA just to spritz it and hold it for a minute, and then you've got it. Okay, now I've got a fair curve along here, curving right into the strongest part of the curve and on around. Okay, so I'll let that set up. I think we've sanded the Draketail down, so there's still about a little less than 1/8 of an inch of extra Draketail along the back edge, sort of a lip here. I'm going to leave that until I've got the epoxy fillet on the inside and that epoxy fillet is set up, and then I'll probably fill in just a little bit here around the back with an epoxy from the outside edge, unless my epoxy from the inside is filled up, and then I'll sand that all down exactly level. And now I've got a smooth curve all the way around. No puckering or bunching or irregularity, which is what you're aiming for, because that Draketail is such an elegant part of the boat. Isn't that nice? The way that it curves around there so evenly. Okay, so good job. Let's go ahead with our epoxy fillet on the inside. I'm going to start with, it's going to be a little tricky reaching in there, and if it's warm you don't want to, it's so much harder to work with the epoxy once it starts to get a little bit set off. So if it's warm, you don't want to mix too much. Let's start with 2 large marks, and we'll see how far that takes us. And that will not be enough, I don't think, for the entire fillet, because we're going on the inside, not on the outside. We're going up the 7AB bulkhead, between the 7AB bulkhead and the Draketail wraparound, and then we're going along on the inside again, along between the bottom piece and the Draketail wraparound, all the way around the back. So we're going to need a fair amount of epoxy, and it's going to be, it's a little hard to reach in there, but we'll use a popsicle stick, and you can, before you get the epoxy in there, well, we'll use a brush to clear coat first. Before you get the epoxy in there, you can just kind of see, okay, that's going to work. And around the Draketail, yeah, a little tricky, but no, that's pretty good, no problem. So use your popsicle stick just to do a trial run there. And let's do it. Now, I don't think there's much way you're going to be able to see what I'm doing. I can just tell you what I'm doing. So I'm doing this is the pre-thickened, two large marks of pre-thickened with 2 small marks of hardener. No phenolic powder. A little dusty in there. Okay, so I'm just spreading it inside there on the joint, about 1/2 inch in on the bottom and 1/2 inch up on the Draketail wraparound piece. So we're getting good coating there. And then up the 7AB bulkhead, and up as tight as far up as I can get there on the Draketail wraparound next to the 7AB bulkhead. A little hard to get up as far as you want, but not too bad. And the other side. And add phenolic powder. Since we have the vertical fillets running up the 7AB bulkhead, we don't want those to slump down. When you're doing fillets where one surface is horizontal, the fillet the mixture can be a little bit runnier and it's not going to just totally droop down. But here, where we're running a vertical fillet, we need this mixture to be really genuinely non-sag, no sag at all, because otherwise that fillet won't stay in place. It'll end up down on the bottom pieces and not up along the 7AB piece. But at the same time, you want creamy smooth. You don't want sticky putty like stuff that's hard to spread. Okay, but this is going to be just a little thicker. Here, let's see if that's going to sag. Yep, it's still going to sag, which would mean my fillet ended up on the bottom. It's almost there though. And that was, I put in 2 partial spoonfuls about like this so far. 2 of those. Now I'm going to do about half that much more, a little bit less than half that much more. And let's see. But don't go by the mixture you're trying to achieve, not by copying exactly how I've measured my phenolic powder, because the temperature of the resin and the temperature of the room will affect the consistency. And now let's see how that's going to do. That looks pretty good. That's a pretty big blob. It's not moving much. And you can see the surface is still shiny and smooth. My actual fillet will be more like a blob that size. See that bit on top that's just fading right in? But the blob itself is not going to drop off the brush, not going to drip down on the table. It'll set up pretty much just like that. Okay, so let's go ahead with that amount. And try not to get epoxy on your 2 square servo mount pieces. And of course, nobody will ever see this except you, but you do want it to be strong, so try to get the epoxy up as high as you can in that fillet between the 7AB and the Draketail. And don't skimp on the epoxy here, because especially since you can't see very well what you're doing, try to get a little light in there, but you can't see terribly well. So use a little excess epoxy, just since there's a bit of a hit or miss phenomenon going on here. So don't try to do these ultra light amounts. Now we really cannot do up a fillet along the top surface of the back deck support piece and the Draketail wraparound. We're not going to be able to get up underneath here, so don't worry about that for now. We'll get that glued on later when we add the deck, when the deck is permanently in place. So not to worry about that yet. Okay, I'm going to switch to the popsicle stick here in a minute and try to clean my fillet up. It's a little bit messy right now. Okay, let's switch, see what we can do here. Now if you're a dentist or an orthodontist, this is just a piece of cake and seems very natural to you. But for the rest of us, we're having to struggle a little bit here, but not too much. It's certainly going to be strong, and it's invisible to anybody except us. So being incredibly neat is not really required. Just make sure you get enough epoxy in the right places to be strong. No, I think we can use another 2 large marks. Again, partly because we're not working entirely blind, but we don't have as easy access as in some glue jobs. And so a little excess epoxy will guarantee that we have plenty of strength. So we'll mix another 2 large marks and 2 small marks of hardener, and then add phenolic powder and finish up inside here. So I'll let you work on that. I'm probably the most concerned about my fillet along the 7AB up to 7AB joint with the Draketail wraparound. I think that's where the most load is. Between the Draketail, this edge, we want to, make it watertight. Actually, we don't want water coming into our boat. But there's not a lot of force on that edge. But there is a fair amount of force holding the wraparound tight to the sides, and so we want to reinforce the little CA joint that we put in there with a good strong epoxy fillet. Okay, nice, look at that. And once the epoxy sets, then we'll finish up sanding off the lip along the back edge of the bottom edge of the Draketail wraparound, and we will have a wrap. Okay, now finishing off in this hard to reach area, I using all our implements. I've used the brush to place the epoxy and start to create fillets, and then I used the popsicle stick a little bit to clean up, get in there a little bit better. And then I used the tip of the spoon to do the fillets along this area where I could actually get the spoon in pretty well. And then I used the edge of the spoon to clean off. There's quite a bit of epoxy just randomly in there. It doesn't help any to have epoxy where it's not doing any good. So I used the spoon to clean off some other areas of epoxy where the epoxy wasn't helping at all. And now, the last step, I've mixed up 1 large mark of clear, totally clear resin, not the pre-thickened, and no phenolic. I did scrape out my container. There's still a little bit of coloring in that resin because I'm using the same container and the same brush, but I did scrape as much of the thickened resin out as I could. And now I'm going to use this clear resin to coat all the surfaces in there. And you'll find that you can actually do a fair amount of cleanup with that clear resin, brushing over. Don't brush right over your fillets, but you can brush over some of the epoxy splotches that you've got that were hard to clean off with just the tip of the spoon. So brush right up to against your fillets, right up to the edge of your fillets, but I think you'll do better not to try to brush over the top of your fillets. Just brush right up to the edge of them. And any place you can see in here, coat with clear epoxy, and that will protect the wood if you ever get any water in here. So any surfaces you can access, we're coating now. And notice as you do it how much it cleans up those random blobs of epoxy that inevitably got places where you didn't need them. Try not to mess up your fillets though. And get as much light in there as you can. You really do have to have some visuals on getting this area done nicely. Right up under the deck, the back deck support piece. You really can't see there though, so that's just by feel. And do the rudder support column at this point. And the inside of the Draketail plywood. And the back side of the 7AB bulkhead. The little square blocks do not need coating though. It's probably better not to coat them. You'll just fill up those the holes that you've drilled in them, and it's easier not to have to re-drill those. try to peer back inside there and get all the Draketail wraparound coated with this clear epoxy. Well, we can also do with this clear epoxy. If you didn't get it with the thickened epoxy, the pre-thickened epoxy, with this clear epoxy, you can go up the edge of the back edge of the rudder support column piece against the Draketail piece and create. It's essentially you'll have you'll get some epoxy between those two surfaces and create a little bit of, even though this isn't pre-thickened, create a little bit of a fillet between those as well. Not too worried about the strength there, but a little glue right along the center line on the inside where the rudder support column should be pretty close or touching the Draketail wraparound. This one you think you've got it all. You see another place where you missed. But I think we're getting pretty good. And you should be really just about using up all that clear. You shouldn't have much excess there. And we're good. Very nice. I'd love to show you back inside here, but I don't know if you'll be able to see it or not. We'll try a camera angle looking down inside there. Okay, it's looking way back to the very back of the Draketail. There, now you can see that. And you see we do really have a, it's not a perfect fillet, but it's really not too bad back in there. There, now you can see it. And there's certainly no gaps. There's no place water can ever come in. It's pretty well coated. And working around this side, whoops. Okay, now you can see in there a little bit better. Now we have a pretty good fillet there. It's not too bad. And the blobs that were on the on the bottom are now smoothed out with the clear resin. You can see some of those streaks where the blobs were smoothed out on the bottom pieces by brushing over with the clear resin. But yeah, very good. Nice. That's plenty good enough for a part of the boat that's totally invisible. Nice. Just a final note. At this point, although the hull shape shouldn't really be affected by the Draketail wraparound setting up, it's not a bad idea. Make sure you don't have any epoxy where the deck is sitting down at the back, but it's not a bad idea to put your deck back in place to make sure the hull is held in the right shape while the Draketail sets up. It really shouldn't affect the shape of the hull, but sliding the deck into place is pretty easy. Remember, start the deck forwards a little bit, 2 inches forwards of its final position, and pull the sides apart, get the deck in place, and slide the deck back all the way against the Draketail. But make sure that before you do that, there's no epoxy between the deck and the back deck support piece or the Draketail wraparound, because you don't want your deck glued in place at this point in just one place. So deck in, looking good, very smooth, and when that epoxy sets up, we'll sand the bottom flush, bottom of the Draketail edge flush with the bottom of the boat, and we'll sand. We'll clean up these joints a little bit more, but they look pretty good now. Good. Okay. Let's see, where are we? Few just sort of general notes. This is the COVID winter, the COVID-19 pandemic winter, and so it's been a little limiting. And but building this boat, I don't think I've had as much fun all winter as I'm having building this boat. It's super neat. And this is the first one I've built. I have been involved in developing the project from the very beginning with Carl and consulting with him and everything, but I hadn't actually built one until this point. Carl has built several of them actually as we developed the concept and they evolved. But this is the first one I've built, and it is super fun. So a couple of notes that occurred to me. One is be kind to yourself. When you're sanding, I wouldn't sand aggressively with the boat on the stand. You could add the felt padding to the stand at this point, but I haven't. But still, even with that, it's just too much point pressure on the hull to be aggressive with it on the stand. So the stand is useful for some steps, but I wouldn't use it when you're sanding hard. Now, here are the bottom pieces, the floor pieces for the inside. They come out of sheet number 4, and now this step, interestingly enough, the pointy ends are at the back of the boat. It looks like, oh, this is a boat shape. Well, no, the floors are the opposite, go in the opposite of the way you would expect. The square square end is towards the front of the boat. So don't make the wrong, I mean, if you just look at them, you'll assume that they're boat shaped, but they're the opposite of boat shape. Square end goes in the front. So don't think we gave you the wrong floors or something. They just won't fit, because they fit in fairly nicely as long as the back end is the pointy end. And now the next step is we're going to fit these floors. So take them out of the part sheet and sand the edges, sand the tabs off the edges, and put them in initially. And you'll find that they don't quite fit initially. And so we're going to make them fit in two ways. One, we can sand the edges of the floors to allow for our fillet, and we can make the floors a little bit narrower. But the outside edges, just along the outside edge of the floor, and you can bevel the outside edge of the floor just a little bit, so as the fillet sweeps up, the floor on the bottom side is beveled to allow for that. But you're going to find most likely that you have to sand the fillet a little bit too, and the fillet's not going to sand. This is a slightly bigger sanding job than we've run into so far, because this fillet's going to be a little hard to sand. It's tough stuff. So you'll want to work on the fillet with 80 grit sandpaper, and then, you know, just to save yourself work later. This is what I meant about being kind to yourself. Instead of putting the bottom of the boat on a hard table surface and then finding there was a little piece of grit or something and scraped up the bottom of the, or a hard epoxy bump or something that was going to dig into the wood. If you have some packing foam or bubble wrap or anything, just set your boat on the foam or the bubble wrap while you sand, and then you can push. You still have to be, this boat it'll be very strong when we get all the interior structure done and the interior furniture and the deck on and all, but it's still a little delicate at this stage. So don't be a gorilla with it at this stage. But what we're going to do, is sand that fillet till the floor fits in nicely, and also visually, the top edge of the fillet is visible along, especially in the middle of the boat along here, and a little bit at the back, although the back seat starts to come forwards and cover up part of the fillet back in the back, towards the back of the boat. But the fillet's going to be visible in here, so and it's not going to be covered up by varnish. Varnish doesn't cover anything; it just makes everything, stand out more. So you can do some smoothing and sanding along in here where it's just for appearance's sake. Another possibility is you can paint the inside of the hull as a later step, but you know, I'm generally you know, anticipating that I'll varnish the inside of the hull. So I want to get at least I'll have that option if I get a smooth finish. Get my fillet, you know, smoothed out nicely. So 80 grit sandpaper for the fillet, and you can sand away at it, and that's going to work fine. Oh, big caution: don't breathe this sanding dust, because what we put in the pre-thickened resin to make it so it doesn't sag, and it's the only additive that creates a fillet or an epoxy mixture that won't sag and yet is still creamy and smooth, is called Colloidal Silica. It's West System 406, the West Goujon Brothers West System wood epoxy saturation technique system. So silica is not something you want in your lungs. It's a major hazard, in fact. So in sanding this, make sure you don't expose yourself to getting the sanding dust in your lungs. Wear either a very, you know, like an N95 mask at least, but a respirator will fit a lot tighter on your face, and will, you know, with cartridges, and that'll be better. Or at least work outside or in an area where if there's a wind blowing and blowing the dust away from you, that makes it a lot safer too. So be very cautious with sanding dust. Now you can hand sand it all starting with the 80 grit, because you're trying to move some of that epoxy out. You definitely will also find that the tabs that you've stuck on alignment tabs, the little cedar 3/4 inch cedar tabs, are going to be sticking out and getting in your way of having the deck, the inner deck, the floors laying flat. You want the floors to end up laying flat on the top flat sections of your V floor frames. So start by sanding the top surfaces of those floor frames smooth. And I've already done this step. I didn't think you needed to see me sanding. But anyway, get the top surfaces of those V floors sanded smooth all the way to the edges, and probably you've got some epoxy bumps on there, and that'll sand off easily. What will take some time to sand is this the fillet, and if you're watching this entire video before you start building, this is a good reminder. Keep your fillet small and neat, especially in this middle area where the floors sit, because otherwise you'll have quite a bit of sanding here. These sanding blocks, the hard rubber ones, where you tuck the sandpaper in under the flap that you lift up. If you pull that back too hard, it'll break off, but you stick the sandpaper in under the flap, and then the flap comes down and holds it on the pins that are underneath there. The ends of these sanding blocks work quite nicely in there, although you don't have a lot of sandpaper surface there, so you're going to use up that sandpaper a little bit more quickly. But you know, this is, you could spend quite a long time and get this, you know, absolutely finesse it perfectly, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I'm not that concerned about it. You're probably the only person that will really ever notice it, because there's a lot of other detail on the boat that will be more noticeable. Anyway, do as much as you think you want, and keep fitting the floors. Set the floors in, see, oh, the bump here, this tab needs to be sanded more, the floors are hitting here. And then push the floors down into place. You can feel if they're against the, you can feel if the floor plywood is against the floor frame by pushing down on towards the outside edge of the floor frame. Push down on the floor plywood, and if it's still, you know, pushing down and bouncing back up, you haven't got it down flat on the frame yet. Towards the very bow, the very front, it really doesn't matter up there under the deck. Your floors can have a bit of an angle coming together. They don't have to absolutely on that front frame, way up, just back about from the front edge of the floors back about 3 or 4 inches. They don't have to be sitting exactly flat there, but back in the middle of the boat, you really want those floors to be sitting flat on top of the V floor frames. Okay, and let's see what else is there. Oh, these floors, positioning them front and back, forwards and back, aft. Do it by the cutout and have the edge of the cutout an equal distance overlapping the 5AB frame, that's the laminated frame back towards the stern, and an equal overlap on the 3AB frame, the laminated frame up towards the bow. So there's a little bit hanging out. I'd say I have about a 1/16 of an inch hanging out over this 5AB frame and about a 1/16 hanging out over the 3AB frame. So keep that even there for the floor placement. And then if you're into sanding, you're going to have a blast with this. But if you want to shorten the job up a little bit, and if you have a Dremel tool, you can do it all by hand, it works fine. But if you have a Dremel tool, especially a Dremel with an extension, the extension, if you have a Dremel tool and you don't have the extension, you will, when you get the extension, you will wonder why you haven't had the extension all along. The big thing about the extension is you can see the diameter of the piece that you're holding that holds the tool. The tip, the cutting tip, is much smaller in diameter, so you can get into spaces much more evenly, and you can hold your tool parallel to the work surface and still be working on it. So if you have a Dremel and if you have a Dremel, get the extension. Just buy the extension. You'll use it so much. You'll really appreciate my urging you to buy it. Typically, we don't suggest buying too many expensive tools, but the extension is wonderful, and a Dremel tool, you'll use it all the time too. And if you have a Dremel, about a 1/2 inch sanding drum with a fairly coarse grit sandpaper on there, and that will speed this up immensely and probably end up with slightly neater job. So you can just run that sanding drum right along in your fillet, and it makes a perfect curve to your fillet and smooths it all out and takes off the excess and takes off the edges of the sanding of the tabs, the positioning tabs that are sticking up in the way of the floor frames, and does a really nice job. Just be remember your hull sides are not very thick. Plywood, don't grind right through them. You could grind through them in just a few seconds actually with the Dremel tool. So have good light, and don't be doing it at an awkward body angle or where you can't really see what you're doing well enough. Make sure you do it carefully. If you've got a lot of RPM here and an aggressive sanding tool, so use some caution with the Dremel so you don't have to do a big patch job on your hull with epoxy. That would take a little extra time. Okay, so and I've sanded up the side of the hull with the I think, let's see, this is probably 120 that I'm using now when I'm doing sort of the finish sanding, but 80 grit is what you want to use initially. Oh, one other point I wanted to show you, and maybe you've been like losing sleep about this, or not, maybe not. You're probably, almost everybody's going to have a gap, a little bit of a gap here between the Draketail ply and the bottom of the boat, and it's like not a big deal. We have the fillet on the inside that's super strong, and at a later point we're just going to fill that gap with epoxy and sand it flush and smooth, and it's going to be perfectly fine. The other thing in sanding the Draketail, you probably got a little bit of V at the back of the boat. It's very hard to get the two bottom pieces actually touching. They're pretty close. That's like a 16th inch gap or something. If you get them actually touching, that's great, and that will make the back at the Draketail, back of the bottom piece, almost flat across there. Let's get our engine bed floor ready to go. It gets 6 doublers on the back side to reinforce it. This will be the bottom side of the engine bed piece, and it'll get these 6 doublers on. To position those, let's make pencil marks. Measure in from the end of the piece 1/4 of an inch, another mark at 2 inches, and another mark at 4 inches. And make the same marks on the other side, and draw lines across at each of those marks, the 1/4 inch mark, the 2 inch mark. These are perpendicular lines, and the 4 inch mark, and the same on the other side. And then place your doubler pieces. These doubler pieces are 2 of them are in the part sheet number 6, and 4 of them are in the part sheet number 4. So find these and clean up the edges, of course. I've already done that. Place them with one edge against your line and draw a line along the other edge. And the same on the other end of your engine bed piece over here. And that's where those will fall. And with those doubler pieces in those positions, they will not interfere with the number 4 floor frame that falls right in the middle of this piece, or with the end frames, 3AB and 5AB. Okay, so this is pretty simple. Should just be one large mark of epoxy should do these pieces. And then it's also good at this time to laminate together the 2 RC deck pieces, which are the pieces that in part sheet number 6, and they're right next to each other. They have angled in ends, and the pieces are about 7 inches long and about 2 inches, just a little over 2 inches wide. So those can be laminated together as well at the same time. With these pieces, you can either use paper or clamps. Actually, it's probably better just to use weights, because that'll keep your piece flat down against the table and you won't get any twist or warp. When you laminate pieces, if they're flat, they tend to stay flat. Okay, so you can go ahead and do that. Laminate together the 2 RC deck pieces, and we will be back. Oh, and the only other thing is find the edges to the RC deck piece, to the engine bed piece. The edges are 1/2 inch wide by just about 10.5 inches long, 10 3/8 inches long. So you can find those pieces and clean up the edges, and then we will be ready to clear coat inside the hull, and we'll glue in the engine bed at the same time, and we'll glue in the RC deck piece at the same time. So you want to have those all ready to go. Okay, I think that should be pretty easy. Again, probably best to just weight this, or you can put it at the edge of the table and clamp it to the table. Anything to keep it flat while it sets up. Now the real point of tonight is to coat the inside of the hull with a clear epoxy. This is the first time we've coated things with clear epoxy. It brushes on just like paint or varnish. It's a little harder to get the clear epoxy really smooth though, and as the epoxy starts to set up, and get a little bit thicker, it gets harder and harder to get smooth. Oh, one more note, these things keep occurring to me. With the Dremel tool, a couple of things. You're creating a ton of dust. It's just going to be a cloud of dust because you're grinding a lot of material off fast. So absolutely, you really don't want to use the Dremel tool without a dust mask or respirator, because that would be really hazardous. The other thing with the Dremel tool, always wear safety glasses, because anytime you're using a fast-moving tool of any kind, something could fly up and hit your eye, which would be tragic. So safety glasses. The Dremel's kind of a noisy, whiny tool. So hearing protections, either earplugs or hearing muffs, are indicated as well. So safety first. Don't breathe the dust. Definitely have a good eye protection, real safety glasses, not just sunglasses or something, and hearing protection. And if you can work outside for the sanding, that's all the better. For the sanding, I took my project up to the shop, and I had the pans going, and also I actually have a hood I wear, or I use a good respirator, either way. Okay, so the goal tonight is to brush on the clear epoxy. We'll just use our regular epoxy brushes, and but as I say, if you mix a big batch, enough for this whole job, by the time you get halfway through the job, your resin's going to be starting to just get a little bit thicker, setting up. It's not going to be hard or anything, but it'll start to get a little bit thicker and harder to spread out thin and smooth. So we're going to mix small batches. We'll mix 2 large marks of resin, and this is the clear resin, not the pre-thickened. 2 large marks of clear resin and 2 small marks of hardener. And then we'll mix another batch when we've used up that amount. And we're also going to start part of this underneath the floor frames and way at the bow. All that's invisible. Nobody will see that. We're just brushing that on for 2 reasons. Partly, it makes the wood totally waterproof, so it'll last for virtually forever. And also, it'll give a hard, stiff surface to the wood, so it just makes the boat a little bit stiffer and stronger. So nobody will see the part up front or in the very bottom of the boat underneath the V floor frames. But the inside side part along the middle of the boat will be visible. So that part we want to get fairly smooth as possible, actually, and neat, because we can sand that and smooth it out before varnishing. But if we have runs and sags, it's really tough stuff. The epoxy's hard, strong stuff, and it's a little bit hard to sand out a big run or sag. So we're going to start each time with a new batch, when the epoxy is at its runniest and spreads and brushes on the easiest. We're going to start where we have the visible sections along the side, on the inside. We're not doing the outside of the hull now, we're just doing the inside of the hull. And so we're going to start where it's most visible while that epoxy is pretty runny and easy to brush on. The other thing is, we're not going to do the top edge of the hull where the deck attaches, because then the deck would not fit on as well. We're just going to go up the side to the bottom edge of our stringer that the deck sits on, just the bottom edge of it. We can do all the framing up at the front, the reinforcing that we put in up here in the front and the bow. We can do the front side of the 7AB bulkhead, but again, don't get up on the back deck support piece. In fact, I just felt this. I have a little bit of epoxy there that on the top edge of that back deck support piece that I should sand off. So anything like that, keep checking for any place that you need to do a little bit more sanding or a little bit more work to get so things are going to fit smoothly together. Now you're very happy with the way the Draketail turned out. It's perfectly smooth around there. The joint, can't even, you know, if I close my eyes and run my finger over it, oh, I can just barely feel it. Just barely. Down here I can't feel this at all. I might sand it a teensy bit more. If you can feel a bump there, you'll be able to see it through the paint. Don't figure the paint's going to obscure it or cover it up. So I'll just use 220 grit here, just a teensy bit there. And we'll also be putting epoxy over that, a real thin, smooth coat of epoxy. This side you can see, it also, oh, in fact, this side I cannot feel anything. I did a better sanding job on this side. Oh, where is it here? No, I closed my eyes. No, I can't feel that at all. No joint at all. But you can see, to get that perfectly smooth finish, I did sand through the top layer of veneer right at the edge on the Draketail fly. I don't know, it's not very visible, but maybe you can see that. Not to worry there, because again we're going to be smoothing epoxy right over that, and so it's not an issue at all. Okay, if I'd sanded through the top layer and through the middle layer, then I'd start to be a little bit concerned. I don't think I would sand that deep. I'd rather fill with epoxy, a thin coat of epoxy, to get a level surface there rather than sand. You don't have much left if you sanded through 2 layers of the veneer. You only have a very thin single inner layer of veneer left. So rather than sand through more than, I really just barely sanded through the top layer and just barely hit the middle layer. So rather than sand anymore, I think it would be better to use an epoxy fill. And you're going to find that these fillets on the inside are hard to sand, because that's the pre-thickened epoxy with the phenolic in it. But for a fill like this at the back, and also for the Draketail and the bottom don't quite meet where we have, you know, at least 1/8 of an inch gap there. There we're going to use clear resin with phenolic powder in it, and you'll find that that sands much more easily. The phenolic powder actually sands quite easily, especially compared to the silica. Silica is actually probably a harder substance than the grit on your sandpaper, or at least equally hard. So that's why the sandpaper is not as effective when you're sanding the silica. But it will sand, it just takes a little bit more work. So we're going to start with 2 large marks of clear resin, not the pre-thickened, and 2 small marks of hardener. We'll get that mixed up and we'll start coating the inside of the hull. Make sure you've got all your sanding dust out. You don't want to be brushing epoxy on top of sanding dust. If you have compressed air, an air compressor, use that. If you have a tack rag, which is a sticky cloth for getting dust, you know, before you varnish, tack rag is really nice to use. You could use some denatured alcohol, you know, like regular medical alcohol, on a paper towel. That would work fine. I don't think I would use water, because then you'd have to let the boat sit for a long time to dry. But the alcohol should dry really quickly. Or take it outside and just blow vigorously, or use a paper towel to wipe it out with. The dry paper towel will get most of the dust out, although it's not quite the best. Or a piece of cotton rag, and which you can kind of flap a rag against it. Oh, one more note. I was as I was working at the computer and had the boat, and was actually putting the instructions together for these steps, for the most recent step. I almost set the boat on the floor beside my chair, and then I thought, oh, that's not a very good idea. So be careful. It's beautiful and a work of art so far. Don't put it on the floor where somebody might trip on it or step on it. So yeah, be careful. And don't have it sticking out, you know, balancing on the edge of some table or something where it might get knocked off the table or anything like that too. That would be too bad to have to do a repair at this stage. Okay, so we'll mix up the epoxy and start to brush it on. I'll show you a little bit of brushing it on, but I don't think you'll have any questions. You're just coating all the bare surfaces. I wouldn't coat the top edge of the floor frames at this point. You just have to sand that again. And you actually, you'd rather have those bare for now. And don't coat in the cutouts here in the middle floor frames, because we will be building the, we'll be adding the engine floor there, and the sides that make a little sort of pan for the engine, where the engine is sitting. Okay, engine and the ballast. We'll have ballast bars down there too, and the battery and everything. Okay, I think we're set. We'll get that epoxy going. Okay, now on brushing this on, I think you'll be able to see okay. I just set my pot right in there. And this is, I just mix this up so it's not you know, brushes are quite thin and clear. It's the clear epoxy. The big thing though, the big point, is you want to get this brushed on as thin as possible, because if you're putting on more than a very, very thin coat, and brush it out very thin. If you're putting on more than a very thin coat, you're going to get runs and sags. Epoxy just is notorious for running. It's so it's got to be just brushed out, so you really get any, you know, if you get a little bristles from your brush in there, get them out, set them aside. So really thin, brush it, you know, brush it out fairly aggressively into the wood and anything off the surface. So that's a very thin coat. If this had set up anymore, I wouldn't be able to get a thin coat because it would just be so thick I couldn't spread it thin. So that's why I'm doing the sides first, where it's visible, and also where it's vertical. Let's see, there you can see there. On the bottom sections, see how much I'm brushing that out. On the bottom sections, where it's more horizontal, I mean it's a V shape, but it's more horizontal, you're not going to get the same tendency to run. There, isn't that something? A little drip of epoxy right where I don't want it, right there. So, any epoxy, if you drip any epoxy on that deck edge, clean it off right away. Now at this point, you know, the reward of sanding your fillet nicely is that it looks pretty good, you know, with this coat of epoxy. It's smooth and regular, it doesn't have lumps and, you know, irregular bumps and everything. And we're just going up to the bottom edge of our deck shelf. We're not going to go over the deck shelf, and we're not going to do the side above the deck shelf where the deck has to sit on. So okay, so I think you got the picture there. It looks like we're going to have enough for the sides, and then maybe one more mixture of 2 marks might do the bottom. So keep it thin, even on the bottom. Keep it fairly thin. You don't want a whole lot of buildup anywhere. You're just trying to coat the wood, the surface of the wood. You get the, you know, you'll get little bristles from the brush. Take them out because they're ugly. Okay, I've used up 2 large marks of resin, and then I mixed another 2 large marks of resin and clear resin with 2 small marks of hardener, and that got me back to the 5AB frame here, and then I need 1 more large mark of hardener with 1 small mark of resin. I mean, 1 large mark of resin with 1 small mark of hardener for the last 2 sections back here. And I think that will do it. So in total, I've mixed up 2 batches with 2 large marks of hardener, so that's 4 large marks of hardener, and then 1 additional batch with just 1 large mark of resin. In fact, I may have misspoken there. 2 batches with 2 large marks of resin and 2 small marks of hardener in each batch, and then 1 final batch with just 1 large mark of resin in it and 1 small mark of hardener. And that's looking like it's coming out just right. So that the total was 5 large marks of resin with 5 small marks of hardener. However, if you mix all that at once, you're going to find that by the end it's pretty hard to spread because it's getting so thick, and you'll be getting sort of a thicker gloppy coating on there that is going to be sure to sag. So and I'm finding, even with mixing 2 large marks, that by the end and brushing it on very fast, I'm very quick at this, that I'm finding by the end of using up the 2 large marks, the epoxy is getting a little bit thicker and doesn't brush on as nicely, and it's fairly cool in here too. It's you know, less than 60 degrees. So if you're working in a warmer space, and or if you like to work at a more relaxed pace, then you might be more comfortable mixing just 1 large mark of epoxy at a time and doing that 5 times. Then you don't have to rush as much, and you might end up with a better job. But if you're quick, you can do 2 large marks at a time. See how it goes. Okay, and I think that's it. We have a little bit of extra epoxy, but not very much. And use of reflection, you can see where you might have a little more buildup one place, or maybe it's all soaked in one place, and you can put on a little bit more on the floors. I really wouldn't put any more on the sides. You're just going to get more sag. Oh, and the other thing is, where you've sanded the epoxy fillet, it's kind of nice to coat over that area, the sanded areas, because you know, it just smooths it out and looks nice. Gives you a glossy surface again. But I would not, you know, where you haven't sanded the epoxy, like down the center line, we didn't sand that at all. I wouldn't coat over that. You know, if you get a little bit of epoxy on top of it, it's not a big deal. But you may not even get that good adhesion there, because if you got an amine blush coming up, we didn't take the, you know, we didn't, there wasn't any real reason to clean off that amine blush, because we don't have to stick to that center line joint of epoxy. That's completed and done. So there's no real, you don't really need to brush over all of the previous epoxy. In fact, you might try to avoid it. You can brush right up to it, and if you get some on top, that's fine. Okay, so that should be just the right amount, and that's all we've got there. And just went back checking with the reflection to see where it was a little bit light, and just to primarily use up my remaining epoxy. Okay, nice. So we can let that start to set up. Now, while we have the pot and the brush ready, let's go ahead and do our engine bed and the sides for the engine bed. And we have to find those in the sheet. And pull those out. We already pulled the engine bed out, remember? Because we wanted to get those floors spaced just the right distance apart. And so hopefully that still fits in there nicely. If it doesn't fit in, you need to sand it a little bit more. In fact, mine looks like it's just a little bit long. Just a teensy bit of sanding to get that to fit in. And then the sides for the engine compartment, let's find those. And they're long and narrow, and it looks like they're in sheet number sheet number 5. And they're the narrow ones in sheet number 5, the long narrow ones in sheet number 5. And not the wider ones. So make sure your floor to the engine compartment, the engine bed, fits in there nicely, sitting on the shelf in the cutout shelf in the 3A and 3B section and the 5A, 5B. On the engine sides, they were just a teensy bit long, and they wanted to bow out just a little bit, and so I sanded them a little bit short and put a little bevel on the edge, because I think there's a teensy bit of epoxy in the corners where they fit in. And so now they're good. And so we're just going to mix pre-thickened epoxy now, and we can use that to coat the bottom of the engine platform because it's not going to show, and that will help secure it to the pre-thickened will help secure it to this middle bulkhead, the number 4 bulkhead or floor frame. And then when we get ready to put in our side pieces, we're going to add a couple of dots of CA, and then go over that with epoxy. And then we know everything will stay in place because of the CA. So let's mix epoxy for the bottom of this piece, and we're going to mix 2 large marks of pre-thickened. So we're switching to pre-thickened resin, but we can use the same container, mixing container, and the same brush that we were using just a minute ago. No problem there. The pre-thickened is the same resin as the clear. It's exactly the same, West 105 resin. And so there's no conflict there. Okay, 2 large marks of the pre-thickened resin, and two small marks of the hardener. And we'll do the shelf there where they sit. We'll get a little extra epoxy on there because this is how we're gluing these pieces of this floor frames in. And the front shelf there. We're doing the back side of the 3AB cut out there, and the shelf, and the front side of the 5AB cut out and the shelf. A little extra epoxy, we're not trying to get that thin. And then we'll do again extra epoxy along this edge here. A lot of it, we can't get too much epoxy on, I mean, it's not going to want to sit on there very long, but so having it run down and go in the bilge doesn't really help any, but a little bit. And we did the bottom, we'll do the bottom especially thickly right across where that number 4 bulkhead is. Okay, and then we're ready to put that in place. Engine bed, floor, and down there, and down here. Okay, that's why you pre-fit things, to make sure that when it's all sticky with epoxy, that it's going to fit at that point, that you're not going to have to try to sand it after the epoxy's on it. And we'll do the outside edges of these. Remember, your bevel is on the outside edge, and we'll do the front of the bevel. We're not going to do the inside edge of these. We can do the bottom edge, but we might we're going to use a little dot of CA on the inside edge. So and CA won't stick to wet epoxy, so don't do the inside edge yet. We will do that later. Make sure your engine, the floor piece is all the way down tight. And now we're ready for our CA. And it looks like on this piece right in the middle is where it's lifting off, not quite touching the floor piece in the middle. So I'm going to do my first shot of CA right there. Just a little dot there. Push it against the frame and spritz it, and down against the bottom. And let's hold that for a second. So this is a slightly new process, using the CA to hold something in place after we put epoxy on it. But we're not putting the CA on top of wet epoxy, we're just putting it on the bare wood, because it's not going to work on top of wet epoxy. Okay, that's got that. That's got a little bit more of a fillet effect than I really wanted, but that's okay. I don't think that'll be in our way. So try to keep these fairly discreet. And I'll put CA up along that front corner. Make sure that stays in place while the epoxy sets up. A little spritz there. Try not to have much CA buildup though, because that may interfere with your ballast bars. So we just want enough CA to keep this piece in place while the epoxy sets up. So I'm spreading my CA along so it doesn't create a bump. I got a bit more of a bump in that middle part than I wanted there. Oh, and then still released actually. That was funny. Small amounts of CA set up faster than large amounts too. So if you've got a large amount of epoxy of CA by mistake, it's going to take longer to set up. Okay, that's holding that in place. I'll add a little bit more epoxy on the outside here in a minute. But let's get the second piece, the outside edge, coated and in place. Coating the beveled ends and the back side and the bottom side. Obviously not as critical pieces here as putting the hull together, but we still want them to be strong and stay in place. Okay, this one in place here. Now I'm trying to find some of the epoxy got up on the edge there, so I'm trying to find a place for the CA that doesn't have epoxy on it already. Looks like that one dot of CA may be enough on this side to hold it in place. Once these are CA'd and staying in place, then we'll add a little bit more epoxy on the outside corners. Yeah, we should have just the right amount here to do the corners. These are not exactly fillets, but this is pre-thickened, so it'll stay in place more or less. If you do it too thick, it's just going to run down the bilge. But if you do it thin, it will reinforce these corners. And we should have just the right amount for what we're doing here. So we're just going into the corners with a thin coating of this pre-thickened, and it'll get into those corners, between the two pieces, and it's also doing a little narrow fillet. It's too runny to do much of a fillet. If you try to do a bigger fillet, it'll just run down. Scrape off a little on the top, and then it'll run down and make a fillet. Don't underestimate how strong this stuff is. Doesn't take much epoxy or CA, but the epoxy is quite a bit stronger than the CA actually for joints. But it doesn't take very much to make a super strong joint. And so you really don't want to be globbing epoxy all over the place. It probably, it just makes it messy and really doesn't add a whole lot of strength to your product, to your project. Okay, that's looking good. And clean off your CA, get the lid back on as quick as possible. And let's get the boat up on a stand. Where's our stand? Here's the stand. And we'll put a little weight on that RC deck to make sure that it stays down tight. And we will leave it. A little piece of marble slab, that's just about right. And one more piece. Yep. Yeah, perfect. Those marble slabs already, I could use a little bit more weight. Those marble slabs already have some packaging tape on them, so they're not going to glue themselves in place here. So, and don't put too much weight in here, you might start distorting things, but there, we've got a little piece of zinc ingot there, and the two marble slabs, and that should hold everything down tightly in place. All the epoxy sets up. Good. Super, that looks very clean and neat and tidy. See if I can turn it and take your brush out of the epoxy container so it'll dry out smooth. And you can see what that looks like. I'll zoom in just a little bit. And then it's a good idea to put the deck back on. I think you'd be okay without the deck being back on, but that epoxy's, you've got a lot of epoxy on there, it's going to stiffen up the sides, and you're just kind of training the boat to be in the right shape with the deck. But that is a reason for being very careful not to get epoxy on the shelf, the deck shelf that the deck is sitting on, because you don't want the deck on there permanently now. You just want to put it on to hold the shape of the boat while that internal epoxy sets up.